Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome. My name is Meredith Gershenson. I'm a research analyst here at workforce.com. And as a discuss, we're going to be talking a little bit about the 2023 economic outlook for hourly staff businesses. Today, we have a very special guest on. We have Curtis Dubay. He is a chief economist at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Curtis, thank you so much for coming on.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So Curtis has tracked the condition of the economy, analyzes the impact of public policy on economic growth, and runs the Chamber's Chief Economist Committee. He has researched and published frequently on a wide range of tax and economic issues and is regularly quoted by the press and has appeared often in the media, including on CNBC, Fox Business, Fox News, and C-SPAN. Curtis has testified before Congress several times and has been cited in newspapers such as the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, USA Today, and Politico. Awesome. A very, very good resume, I would say. To give everyone a quick lay of the land of our Big Marker webinar platform, to the right, we have the chat box. We would love if you just drop your questions in there. We will have a Q&A at the end, so I will be sure to moderate that. To get everyone familiar with it, I'd love to hear where you are dialing in from. So I'm coming in from Chicago myself. Awesome. And then as we're letting people fill that out, we do have a couple poll questions as well. Those will just slide right on the bottom left of your screen. If those who are interested in the slide deck that Curtis will be presenting on, I will share that at the very end of the webinar with all of you to download and be able to pass on to your peers. And then finally, just to give a little background on workforce.com, we are a workforce management software company who specializes in scheduling and time and attendance. Our overarching goal is to help business leaders and frontline managers make the best decision for their company. Cool. Awesome. It's great to see everyone's coming in from. And then without further ado, Curtis, I'm going to hand it off to you. I'm going to throw the slides on here and let you take it away.
Thanks, Meredith. And it's great to see people from all over the country. What I'll talk about today will apply to the economy and country as a whole. But maybe when we get to Q&A, it'd be really good to hear some unique insights as to what's going on in the different areas all over the country, because our country is so big, the economy is so varied that there are unique regional impacts, and those are always interesting to hear. And those unique characteristics or those unique what's going on in those areas sometimes requires different policy responses. So it does help inform the big picture. As we get into the discussion today of what's going on with hourly workforces, I do want to say that I have good news for all of you. You're going to have an easier time getting workers, and wage increases will moderate into 2023. The pendulum of who has power in the labor market between employees and employers, which is now firmly in favor of employees, is going to move further back in your direction as we get into 2023. And that's the bad news about that, is that it's going to do that because the economy is going to soften. It already is softening now, and it may slow to the point of recession next year. Now, usually during a recession, that pendulum, and I'm going to talk about this pendulum a lot, the pendulum of labor market power between employees and employers, usually it swings firmly very far in the direction of employers because job losses are so high. And jobs become scarce, there are layoffs, the unemployment rate rises pretty sharply, wages falls, consumer spending falls. Now, in our current environment, that won't necessarily be the case because of the uniqueness of our current economic situation, post-COVID and high inflation. And specifically in those impacts on the labor market. This will limit the improvement of your market power compared to what it otherwise would have been. So that pendulum is not going to swing as far in your direction as it normally would during a soft economic period. I'm going to talk a lot about the uniqueness of our current economic moment, and use the image of the pendulum frequently as we go forward. I'm going to get into the specifics of what will happen in 2023. I want to point out that 2024 could be a whole different situation, which I can get into in Q&A, or we could talk about in further discussions. Before I dig deep into the specifics of what's going to happen in the labor market in 2023, I'm going to do a high-level overview of where the economy is now and where it will be in next year. you need that high level understanding to understand what's going to happen in the labor force, specifically with the hourly workforce next year. I'm going to use a few slides that I maintain. This is part of a much larger deck that I keep. There's lots of charts and data, and each chart has annotations and more data in the notes section. Meredith has that slide deck, and she can distribute it to you, all of you. It is free for you to use. Please take it, use it, disseminate it widely. All right, so let's get into where the economy is right now. We're looking for the economy to grow roughly at 2% this quarter. So the ranges of estimates out there are between, say, 1.3% and 2% growth. Roughly the same for the fourth quarter. If that happens, we'll get roughly a 2% growth for the year, which isn't bad when you consider that the economy contracted in the first 2 quarters. Now, of course, that has led to the big question of whether we had a recession in the first part of the year. Now, notice that I said had a recession. Because we anticipate that the third quarter will be positive, we would have been out of the recession, say, late June or early July. We only have about 2 weeks left of this quarter before it wraps up on September 30th. And it looks like the quarter will come in positive. So if we had a recession, it would have been over by the middle of the year. Now, when we talk about a recession, if any of you have taken Economics 101, you know that the definition in the textbook, what you learn the first day, is 2 consecutive quarters of negative economic growth, which again we had in the first and second quarter. The issue arises, this whole discussion about did we or didn't we have a recession, because there are other factors that the Committee of Economists considers. These are famous economists. You would know their names. They meet at some point and decide whether we had a recession. There are other factors that go into that consideration. Things like jobs, income, spending, manufacturing output. Usually it's a pretty cut and dry question. Usually it's the economy contracted for 2 quarters and all those things fell. Well, again, back to this uniqueness of our current economic moment, those things didn't fall at the first half of the year. Income rose, spending rose. We got retail sales for today. They rose again. Job growth was very strong, and industrial output, manufacturing output expanded through the first part of the year. So it's very hard to see it's a muddy picture about whether we had a recession, because those things all grew even while the economy contracted. Usually when the economy contracts, especially for 2 consecutive quarters, those things are going to fall as well. But because that didn't happen, the question really is a harder one to answer. And when it comes to the end of the day, though, I don't think it really matters whether we had a recession or we didn't. It's kind of irrelevant. It doesn't change the facts on the ground. It's retroactive at this point. It doesn't make what happened in the first part of the year any worse. It doesn't make it any better. It doesn't really change anything in a tangible way. What does matter is that consumers feel like we had a recession, and they feel like we're still in one now. This is a chart of consumer sentiment. It goes back to I think that the dates are wrong. This goes back to February of 2020. So it's 2.5 years. And this is the pandemic consumer sentiment. Consumer sentiment, this is really wild, is lower today. Well, it rose slightly in July and August. We're going to get new data tomorrow on where it is for early September. But as of June, it hit the lowest level it's ever hit. So think about that for a moment. Consumers felt worse about the economy in June. Remember, incomes are rising. Consumers are spending really well. Jobs are plentiful. Manufacturing output's rising, or at least holding steady. And consumers feel worse about the economy back then than they did at any point during the Great Recession. So any point when the housing market was tanking, when financial institutions were failing day after day, week after week, feel worse about the economy right now than they did then. They feel worse about the economy now than they did when in April, May, June of 2020, when the pandemic was just starting and we were all locked in our houses. It's really remarkable how badly consumers feel about the economy. the thing is, there's good reason for it. It all comes down to inflation, and specifically, do we have gas prices? I didn't put the gas price slide in here. It's inflation. Inflation is what is driving sentiment down so low. Interestingly, there is a split here. So usually when sentiment is low, consumer activity is low too. That hasn't really followed. That has a lot to do with all that pent up savings that occurred during the pandemic. So consumer positions are still strong. They still have the money to spend. Income growth has been pretty sharp. All you know, we'll talk about wages in a minute. All you know that wages have been growing. So consumers are still spending even while they feel really bad about the economy. But they feel really bad about the economy because of inflation. So we got numbers on inflation earlier this week. It's now 8.3% on an annual basis. Came down a little bit, but we did have that big market freak out, panic on Tuesday when that number came out because there was a lot of anticipation that the number would be negative, that inflation would decline between July and August. It was the expectation. I don't know who they poll or they talk, who the analysts are, who they get the consensus estimate from before these big data releases. I don't know where they come from, but the consensus estimate was that the inflation would be negative 0.1%, so a very small decline in inflation. The number came in at 0.1% positive, so it was off by 0.2%, and that was enough to tank the markets by 1,300 points. The reason I bring that up is because it just shows you the volatility that inflation creates. It's bad for the economy. It's bad for financial markets because it does create that volatility. So we're going to see swings like that on very small bits of data going forward until we get past inflation. So we're still at 8.3% inflation. The expectations were for a negative month of growth because gas prices have come down so much, and they've come down fairly sharply in the last couple of months. They're still much higher than they were a couple of years ago, or even a year ago. They're still up 22% compared to a year before, but they are down considerably. It's under $3.70 a gallon nationally on average, and we were up over $5 not that long ago. Still a lot, still high, but not as high as it was. I bring up gas prices because the reason why consumers feel so badly with the economy relative to inflation is that it's hitting their budgets really hard because it's hitting necessities. So gas, which we just talked about, and then food prices. Food prices are up 11.4% annually, and that's been rising. And it doesn't show a lot of signs of slowing down. There's reasons for this. There's been some bad weather lately. There's been the issues with Ukraine, fertilizer, diesel prices. There are reasons for it, but it's hitting family budgets really hard. So if you imagine that you spend a lot of your money on energy, food, and then shelter, which has also risen very sharply and is now starting to be calculated into the inflation data, you can see why consumer sentiment would be so low with inflation so high. And of course, it creates lots of uncertainty, which consumers are feeling. And when inflation is as high as it is, and even with strong growing wages, one way to calculate it using the data is, rather than that kind of anecdotal way, is to say that what's going on with real wages, inflation adjusted wages. Again, you all know that you're paying your workforce a heck of a lot more than you were a year ago. Real wages are up over 5% on an annual basis. But when inflation's running 8.5%, you're still seeing your real wage, your inflation adjusted wage, decline by 3%. And families really, really feel that. And they feel the pain of that every time they go to the grocery store, every time they fill up, every time they're paying their rent or their mortgage. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about what caused inflation. I'm going to break them into two different categories because I think it's instructive to explain the last year or more of what's going on with inflation. So if you remember back a year ago, there was all this discussion about inflation being temporary or transitory. And there were factors that were temporary that are abating now or have abated. And those are really come out of COVID. The pandemic changed our composition of demand. We had a before COVID, we had a mix of services and goods that we bought. COVID shifted it heavily in terms in favor of goods. Can't spend on as many services during a pandemic. We shifted to buying goods. Of course, there were lots of fiscal support to help stoke demand during COVID, and that increase in demand and shift to goods demand caused issues in the supply chain. COVID in general caused issues in the supply chain. Workforce issues caused issues with the supply chain, and so the supply chain got really constrained, and that caused the supply chain caused a lack of supply. So very high demand, problems with supply, prices rose very sharply for goods. You had certain goods that you just couldn't get, so prices went through the roof. Cars are a good example. New cars are still very expensive because automakers can't roll them off the assembly lines as fast as demand would dictate because of the lack of chips and other things. So that's a good example, and that's still pushing inflation up pretty high. Car prices were up still pretty sharply in August, and that is also translated into rising prices for used cars. So we had those issues with very specific to COVID. And then all that fiscal support also led to a huge rise in savings. Savings were in aggregate $2.7 trillion over trend during COVID. So that's not just the total amount of savings, that's above what we would have saved had COVID never occurred. So that savings glut allowed for increase in demand it's still occurring now. It's only been spent down about 2.5 trillion. It allowed for a prolonged period of increased demand because of the huge buildup. And then lastly, I alluded to it, the workforce shortage has led to rising wages in an inflationary environment. You're going to have businesses passing on those wage increases to consumers in the form of higher prices. So that's the temporary part of inflation. And those, for the most part, are now winding down. What's going to keep inflation high through the end of 2024, which is the earliest I see this coming down, is monetary policy. The Fed, for very good reason, greatly increased the money supply when COVID hit. They wanted to prevent a financial crisis from occurring while a pandemic was raging. They did a very good job doing that. The money supply, though, increased by $5 trillion, and that is leading to inflation today. $5 trillion was much more than the economy grew since February of 2020. So anytime that you have too many dollars chasing too few goods and services, you're going to get a rise in the price level. And that is what has occurred. It's taken a couple of years for that really to manifest. There are big lags in monetary policy. So it's taken 2 years for that to filter through to the real economy. It's going to take a couple of years for it to filter back out. What the Fed needs to do is slow the money supply so that the economy can catch up. They're not going to reduce it. I don't think that's going to happen. They're just going to slow the growth. You can see that's really just started to happen. That's what that big arrow is. That's the shift in monetary policy to bring down the growth of the money supply and allow the economy to catch up to it so that the price level can cool. It's going to take a while. Like I said before, it's going to be until the end of 2024 before it comes down. In the interim, I think the economy will be pretty rocky. I think we're in for a period of slow growth in 2023, possibly a recession, 50-50 chance. If I didn't say that before, I think it's a 50-50 chance that we have a recession in 2023. 2024 could be even worse as inflation continues on. I do think once we get past this bout of inflation, that things look pretty good, that the economy will grow fairly strongly, because it turns out the economy was in really good condition in February of 2020. Usually when you have a shock like we went through with COVID and the economic fallout, there are other dominoes that fall. If you remember back to the 2007 and 2009 period, that we had a financial crisis, then a housing crisis, we had sovereign debt crises, we had all these different things happening in the economy, things filtered through. That was the fear when COVID hit, that we'd have other bubbles bursting, the old saying that when the tide goes out, you find out who's swimming without a bathing suit. That didn't occur this time. We didn't see that because there was strong, the underlying economy was very strong before COVID hit. So I think once we get fully past COVID and fully past inflation, we're in for a good period of economic growth. It's just the next couple of years are going to be really dicey and rocky. We're going to have good quarters and bad quarters, good months and bad months. We're going to have days when the stock market, I'm pointing to CNBC over my shoulder, goes up 1,300 points and days when it drops 1,300 points. It's just the nature of what happens when inflation is rampant in the economy as it is right now. Inflation is a pernicious force that you have to get out so that you can return certainty to the marketplace, to employers, to businesses, to consumers, to workers. So that's what the Fed's going to be focused on because it really is so disruptive to the economy. The way the Fed will slow the growth of the money supply and bring inflation down is by raising interest rates. They have raised the federal funds rate 4 times this year. They should be raising it again next week and probably one more time before the end of the year. And then they will continue to raise the interest rate throughout 2023. If you watch financial markets, if the press, you'll see that not that long ago, you had some people saying that the Fed might cut interest rates in 2023. That is insane. That is not going to happen. The inflation is much too high for interest rate cuts to occur anytime soon. The Fed needs to get inflation much closer to its 2% target before it even considers stopping raising interest rates, never mind cutting them. Something very bad would have to happen in the economy for us to be looking at rate cuts anytime before, say, 2024. But so the Fed will raise interest rates to cool demand, which will higher interest rates and anti-inflationary monetary policy does 2 things. It cools demand, and then it also it cools demand and it slows the growth of that money supply. It's going to cool demand because it's going to make the price of anything we use credit to buy more expensive. The easiest way to see that is with the interest rates rising for the housing market. This is a chart of the average 30-year fixed rate mortgage. It started 2022 at 3%. It is now 6% as of this morning. It's doubled in 9 months. That is a very sharp increase, very steep increase. That's going to make buying a house more expensive, especially if prices don't adjust downward rapidly, and they're not yet. All major housing data, major housing market data points have declined sharply in recent months, but prices have not fallen as sharply yet. So while they remain relatively high, demand's going to cool because that's increasing the price for home buyers. We haven't seen it fully yet, but I expect it in the next few months. The same thing applies for any consumer good that we buy with credit. So yes, homes and home repairs, but cars, car repairs, home improvement, boats, RVs, trailers, home furnishings, vacations, carrying credit card balance. Any of those things that we use credit for will see reduced demand because of increased interest rates. That will cool demand and bring down prices in those areas, but that will seep out into other areas that aren't as interest sensitive, and you'll see demand come down and prices come down eventually. It takes a while. Again, there's lags in monetary policy. Same thing applies for businesses too. The cost of borrowing for businesses has gone up significantly this year. This is the average rate on a AAA rated corporate bond. It's gone from around 2.5% to over about 4.5%, which is significantly more expensive. That means that businesses will find investment that otherwise would have been profitable, less profitable, and they won't make those investments. Business investment is also another major component of the economy. That will further cool demand because businesses won't be investing as much. So the next question is, will it work? Will all those higher interest rates, will it work to cool inflation and cool demand? Yes, but again, it's going to take a while. There are lags. Important to remember, though, that this is not the experience we had in the early 1980s and the late 1970s. It's good to revisit that to explore the differences. So back then, Paul Volcker, the Volcker Fed, he comes in and with an express mandate from new President Ronald Reagan to stamp out inflation. And Volcker did that in a rather ruthless way. He raised the federal funds rate to over 20%. That had a bunch of effects. One, it created a severe recession in 1981 and 1982. It was short-lived, though. It was about 6 months. In the aftermath, though, a couple things happened. We had a booming economy until the S&L crisis later in the 1980s. And we had a period of low inflation that lasted up. It's called the Great Moderation. It lasted until March of last year. So it was very painful for the real economy, but it had really positive impacts. So monetary policy will stamp out inflation, but it can be painful. What's different this time, though, is that we had had a decade of high inflation. There's a lot of psychological factors that go into inflation. The psyches of businesses, of us, just us as a general economy and a people, was to expect higher inflation. It became ingrained in our expectations. That makes it a lot harder for monetary policy to be effective. That's why the Volcker Fed had to be so ruthless. If you see this chart, you can see that our inflation expectations, this is market measured inflation expectations, remain, the term is anchored, but they're not very high. They're right around where the Fed wants inflation to be in the long term. That's a very good thing. If we don't expect inflation to be higher than, or to really take off, those monetary policies will be a lot more effective and sooner. Maybe we don't have to have as big of rate increases, certainly not to the same length that we had them in 1980. Now, if the economy does get pushed into recession, it's not going to be like that 1981, 82 experience. Let's do that. Let's look at what this means for the general economy in 2023. So I do expect it to be a low growth year. I don't have an estimate for it yet. We need to see what's going to happen in the next couple of quarters before we have a firmer grasp on what could happen next year. But I do expect growth to be low. 2% would be extraordinary next year. I think that's probably not going to happen. So 2% is probably the best case scenario. We could have an actual recession, one where the economy contracts for those 2 quarters and income, spending, jobs, industrial output, they all decline. I put that at about 50-50 chance next year and maybe even higher into 2024. Now, that's the no soft landing scenario. That's the kind of the terms that the financial press uses, that we don't get that soft landing in the economy and that we do have a recession. Again, I said this before, but it's worth repeating that inflation is such a huge problem for the economy that the Fed has to stamp it out regardless of the economic pain and damage it causes. Those expectations that we don't expect for a much higher inflation does mean that there is the chance that the pain might not be as bad as otherwise would be. And some unique circumstances that I'm about to delve into make a softish landing more likely. But it is by no means certain. Quick side note before I shift into the discussion of the job market and specifically the hourly wages. We're talking about 2023 today. 2024 could be different. 24 could be even worse than 2023. Still much too soon to know. But if I did say this before, the economy is poised to be really good in the aftermath. I think I did hit on that. So happy to talk more about that during Q&A. But we're in good shape once we can get past this really bumpy couple of years. So let's shift now to the discussion of the hourly workforce. So a slowing, possibly recessionary economy next year will, again, back to that image of the pendulum, shift market power back in your direction as employers. And there's going to be a lot of reasons for that I'll get into. The thing that I'm watching to figure out where that barometer, where that pendulum is the return to work, return to the office. It's very clear and this is for white collar, more salary workers that work in office settings like this, the impact will be felt sooner by hourly workers, I think. But that the return to work is important because it's very, very, very clear through business surveys and all sorts of labor market surveys that employers want employees back in the office. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I think they've seen that productivity, efficiency, gains in new ideas really suffer in a virtual environment. It's a lot better to be have around each other more often. And just anecdotally here in Washington, D.C., I've talked to a bunch of people because I've been out and about, kind of getting back to normal in the last few weeks. It all of a sudden feels like we are getting back to normal. But return to office, at least in Washington, D.C., it's not, the data is not there. We're not fully back to offices in urban settings. But employers want employees back. Employees don't want to go back. I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't know. They are very hesitant. They don't want to go back. Here in Washington, D.C., it's unpleasant to commute. And so a lot of people have taken a shine to staying home and working from home. They feel as though they're just as productive at home as they are remotely or in the office. Employers don't like it. They can't, besides the efficiency and productivity gains and the new ideas and the collaboration, they want to have a better sense of what their workers are up to. Employees have been able to say no until now because they have the market power. It's very hard to replace workers. It's very hard to get new workers. So employers have kind of been stuck in limbo. Once things start to shift, once the economy softens and the job market, that power swings back further in the direction of employers, I think you're going to see a much more stringent return to work policy. I think we saw this a couple weeks ago with the major banks in Wall Street saying, hey, it's time to come back to the office. We know a lot of you decamped from New York, and that was fine for the pandemic, but we're past that and we want you back here. So it's gradually starting to change. It hasn't changed in a big way, but that's the one thing I'm looking for to really understand what's going on in the labor market. Like I said, I think that the hourly workers probably feel that effect sooner, so that means that you'll have more power, and that will be good for you. But there are a few reasons why I don't think it's going to shift fully in your direction. But I do think at best it gets back to neutral, which is a lot better than where it's been, but it's certainly not going to be fully in your direction. The reason why I don't think it shifts all the way to you is that demand is still greater than businesses can meet, even with everything that's going on in a slowing economy. Diminished workforces have made it really hard for businesses to make the goods and provide the services that their customers demanded. So we could see a pretty big drop in demand, and that would mean, even with that drop in demand, businesses aren't going to start laying workers off because they still need all the workers they have to meet the even diminished demand that is occurring. So even with a weakening economy in 2023, I don't see big layoffs because we have been through this lengthy period where businesses learned that they need workers and that it's really painful to be in a situation where they have too few of them. So I think they'll keep workers on payrolls as long as they possibly can. They'll also want to be ready to capitalize on strong growth in late 2024 and into 2025. It's really hard to do that when you have a diminished workforce. So I think they'll be willing to keep workers on payrolls a lot longer than they otherwise would have. So that also means that unemployment doesn't rise as much as it otherwise would have, and wages don't fall as much as they otherwise would have. Again, this is unique for a possibly recessionary economy, but we're in a very unique circumstance in the larger economy. So all these things are going to mute the swing back in the favor in the pendulum. So it means that it doesn't go back in your direction as far as it otherwise would have. But there are going to be things that are going to push in your direction that come from the weakening economy. Demand for labor is going to decline. So that there's two things that are going to push it in your favor. So demand is going to decline, and then I'll get to labor supply is going to increase. So demand will decline as the economy weakens. It's not going to come, though, from the traditional large layoffs. I think it starts with an elimination or just not the filling of job postings. So we have a record number of job openings, 11.24 million as of the end of July. That's the latest data. That is 5.6 million more than unemployed workers. This is unprecedented. So what I think happens first is the economy slows, demand comes down. Businesses want to keep workers on the payroll, so maybe they stop posting, or they just don't fill those job openings. Also, quits would in this situation are going to decline. Still have near record high quits, 2.7% quit rate in July, and 4.2 million people quit. That's still near their high. That will decline as workers stay rooted in their jobs, and hiring will slow. Hiring is still really strong. We had another really big job growth in August. So job gains and hiring slows, but we're still at a really high level. It could slow to 150,000, which is still pretty decent. Even that come way down, but it could still be positive. We might have a month here where it gets below 100,000 or is negative, but then in the next month it grows by 75,000. It'll slow substantially, but not those persistent month after month declines in the job market, because the impact on the labor market is going to hit in that job openings first. But demand for labor will decline, just not as much as it otherwise would have in a normal recessionary environment. So jobs will be scarcer, hiring will be less. Well, they're still going to be happening, but they're just not going to be happening at the same rate they're happening now. Now, the other thing that, again, pushes the market power in your direction is that labor supply will increase. So demand down, supply up, price of labor comes down. Again, you're going to have more market power. The reason why labor supply will be increasing simultaneously is that we're going to see a big re-influx of workers to the labor market. We had 786,000 join the labor market in August. It's a huge number. We are now at the same labor market level that we had prior to COVID hitting. The issue is that our participation rate is still way, way below where it was pre-COVID. If we had the same participation rate we had back then, there'd be 2.75 million more workers in the labor force. Now, that is a big part of the shortage that we're experiencing. Those those workers are going to come back to the labor market, and they're going to start coming back in droves very soon. And the reasons are they're really twofold. One is the end of COVID. COVID has kept a lot of people out of the labor market. So whether you were sick with COVID, or caring for someone who was sick with COVID, had long COVID, or caring for somebody who had long COVID, quarantining issues. If you're working next to somebody who has it, now you have to leave until you test negative. All those things that we've dealt with the last couple of years. And then schools and daycares. Schools mostly back to normal. Daycare still remain an issue. They have workforce shortages themselves. They have kind of strict quarantining rules. So if you have children below preschool age, it's been a real problem to get daycare for your child. That should be getting better as we go forward. It's hit women harder. Women tend to be the care providers still. It's kept a lot of them from returning to the workforce as fast as they otherwise would have. Hopefully that improves as we move further and further past COVID. The other thing is that will push people back into the labor market is a dwindling of savings. I talked about how savings were enormous in the post-COVID world, or during the pandemic. They're dwindling now. They're dwindling for lots of reasons. One, inflation. There's a silver lining to inflation is that it's bringing that savings amount down, and meaning people have to return back to work. Government support is over. There's no more rounds of checks. There's no more increased unemployment benefits, other pandemic support. There's an end to the limited number of things to spend on. During the pandemic, you just can't spend on certain things. So we're now more services that we can buy. And then there was a very lengthy moratorium on rent and mortgages. And so you add that in, having to pay for a major necessity, people's reservoir savings will decline pretty rapidly, and they're going to have to go back to work to pay their bills. So what does this all mean? Again, declining demand for work, increasing supply of workers, the pendulum back probably to about right in the middle, not really favoring either one, but a lot better for you as employers than where you've been. This means less upward pressure on wages. So maybe wage growth doesn't come negative, or doesn't come all the way down to zero. It is maybe around 3% annually in 2023, but way down from where it has been, maybe below that. These are some other really important factors. Less absenteeism, so people just not showing up. Again, I hit this earlier, less quitting, less people not showing up for their first day, more ability for you as employers to be selective. A lot of people have to take the workers that they can get right now. You can be more selective on who you hire. There's still going to be some of all these issues going on. It's going to linger for a while, but you're going to be in a much better position than you were the last couple of years. Okay, that's it for the economy and the labor market. But let me just conclude with a few risk factors that you should be aware of to the analysis that I've gone through today. We could have a really hard landing in the economy. That means that unemployment goes way up. This is if you know who Larry Summers is. Larry Summers was a Treasury Secretary under President Clinton. He worked as a top advisor for President Obama. He was president of Harvard. He's a very well-regarded, famous economist. He's been very, very, very right on inflation up till now. He's wrong on the Inflation Reduction Act, but right on inflation in general. He says that unemployment has to rise at least to 4.5% to get the unemployment rate has to rise to at least 4.5% to get inflation down anywhere near the Fed's target. So that's the hard landing scenario. In that scenario, unemployment goes up, lots of job losses. There are big layoffs. We have a severe recession. Demand falls. That's really bad for businesses because you're going to see your earnings decline. It's good for labor market power, but for bad reasons. That's certainly something that is a possibility. It's something that you need to be planning for. Something else arises that worsens the economy. So we don't have necessarily a hard landing, but then something else happens to make the economy in worse shape. There's always these unknown unknowns. So just think back to the last few recessions that we've had: a pandemic, a financial crisis, a dot-com bubble bursting, an S&L crisis, an oil shock, things like that. All those risks always occur. But if something like that happens, it's going to change all the things that I've laid out today. It's going to make that hard landing scenario more a reality. Geopolitical turmoil. So things devolve, get worse in Russia and Ukraine with the war there, or there's some spillover. China invades Taiwan, or something else happens on the global scene. And the last thing that I will I'll lay out is political here in the U.S., and this is in regards to the midterm elections. And so if you have Democrats retaining control in November, I think you're likely in store for much more spending. It's just what Democrats do. They've been very clear they want to keep spending. That would mean more inflation. It's going to counteract the Fed's actions to bring inflation down. That means new taxes and new anti-business regulations. If Republicans win, the risks are from government shutdowns. This would come from having to pass a budget and having to pass a debt limit increase. They're going to be very reluctant to do either, even though those are must-do things. And the political dynamics here in Washington are really poor for even getting must-pass things done. And you get a really elevated risk of a prolonged government shutdown that would have bad effects on the economy for as long as it goes on. So I've been going for 45 minutes. I think this is a good place to stop. Just to recap, we are in for a bumpy ride through 2023 and into 2024. After that, things look much better. Inflation won't be down to 2% until at least 2024, and we might not get back there. It might be a case where we decide that 3% is good or 2.5% is good, and we're just going to shift our focus on the economy as something else. So I'll stop. And again, the pendulum back to neutral for you on the labor market in 2023. I'll stop there, and time for Q&A. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Curtis. That was amazing. Definitely covered a lot. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. I just really wanted to touch on some of the poll questions that we had throughout. It's interesting. We're talking about, the job gap, and even this slide right here that's showing some of the poll questions touched on that a little bit. And some of the audience members were saying that they have noticed that power shift towards their employees over the past couple of years, right? And of course, to hear that that's actually going to shift over back to the employer is probably very relieving to a lot. A lot of people have actually started to take off some job postings, and they're not backfilling as much, which is really great to see. Some people, I would say the majority, around 75%, are still backfilling positions, hiring, still compensating for kind of what was with the pandemic. So I hope that was some good news that Curtis has shed in the upcoming years on lower absenteeism rates, lower quit rates, all that good stuff. But yeah, I would love to dive in to some of the questions that we have it here. So for Ryan asked a great question towards the end. He said, can you touch on the current GDP? Where is it trending, and how is this affected by inflation?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Like I said at the top, I just closed the slide deck. If you pull it back up, Meredith, I can pull that chart up. I think that where we are right now is roughly 2%. The thing that really makes it hard for this quarter to figure out is trade flows. Trade flows, inventory, those business inventories, they shift in big ways from quarter to quarter, and they can greatly influence the top line number. So a lot of us will look just at what did consumer spending do, and what did business investment do, and those have been actually fairly good. It's the swings in the other things. That's why the first quarter was a huge huge buildup in inventory in the fourth quarter of 2021, drawdown in the first quarter, and you get a negative number, and there were some trade issues as well. And there wasn't that much consternation about the first quarter. Second quarter was more weakness in the economy, so there was a little more concerning. But again, it was just the one quarter, and I think it's rounded up there. But I think it's like a negative 0.6% for the first quarter or second quarter, so it wasn't that bad. So again, for the third quarter, in general, the fundamentals, again, this consumer spending, business investment, those things. Although even residential investment is going to fall a lot because of the housing market, but those the big important numbers we should be pretty good. It's what happens with those things that swing a lot, inventories and trade. I think trade should be fairly good. I think exports have been strong and imports have come down a little bit. The problem with inflation right now is that the value of the dollar is going up because we're raising interest rates. There's a lot of foreign flows into the U.S., pushing, making it's less expensive for us to buy imports. That helps on inflation, but it reduces kind of the accounting way GDP is done. So there could be some timing issues that would greatly impact what that number is when we get it, and it'll be the 30th. I think it's a Friday, the last Friday of the month. No, it'll be Thursday, the 29th. We'll get the third quarter. You know what? No, we won't get it until next month. This isn't even the end of the quarter, so we won't know for 6 weeks what the number is. And then inventories. The reports on that are all over the place. Some say the inventories are building. Some say their supply chain issues remain really, really bad, and that businesses aren't building inventories. I don't know. I read all the business surveys. It's hard to know, but I would say that the underlying number is still pretty good. Those other issues can make the top line number fluctuate for a quarter until everything gets fully accounted for and adjusted. But then I would expect the fourth quarter to be much like the third quarter because I don't see a lot changing. So I think that the last half of the year will be much better in terms of growth for for this year. In 2023, like I said, at best 2%, and that would be really a huge accomplishment. If we got 2% in 2023, that means the Fed pulled off a magic trick that would no one was anticipating, or it's like a 16 seed winning an NCAA tournament to exceed 2% growth, because most people expect a recession next year. Again, 50-50 chance to hit on the upside for growth when it's expected to be very turbulent would be just kind of incredible. So I expect slow growth in 2023. That's the most likely outcome. And then 2024, I would say, could be even worse if inflation remains intransigent through 2023.
Mm-hmm.
And the Fed's going to, again, I said this earlier, it's going to remain aggressive. This is the number one thing it has to do right now, get inflation down, and it has to use all the tools and that is available to it. And all those tools will cool demand in the economy, which means that growth will necessarily slow.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. Cindy asked a great follow-up question. How is 2024 going to be different than 2023?
The way that it's different is that inflation, we're at 8.3%. It took 2 years to get there. It takes 2 years to get back. Mm. That inflation remains entrenched, and that slow growth remains, and that the slow growing economy means that we work through all those job openings. That job openings fall, and then we get into layoffs. So corporate earnings deteriorate, business earnings deteriorate. Businesses want to hang on to workers, but they can't, so layoffs occur, incomes fall, spending declines, so we get a softer economy in 2024 than we had in 2023. Whether that means another recession or a first recession, hard to predict, but I would say that right now 2024 is lining up to be weaker than 2023. But then the rebound occurs. It really comes down to how aggressive the Fed decides to be.
Right.
So right now, most anticipate a 75 basis point increase in the federal funds rate on Wednesday, and then another increase before the end of the year. That'd be 6 increases this year, and then more increases in 2023. Did I say that the thing about some anticipating rate cuts next year? Because there are some that anticipate that. That's not going to happen. If the Fed pushes ahead and is really aggressive, they can maybe stamp inflation out before early 2024, and then we get that rebound earlier. If they delay, hoping to thread the needle, have the soft landing, the pain could be extended into 2024. That's why I brought up the Larry Summers thing. What he's trying to say by saying the unemployment rate necessarily has to rise to 4.5%. It's not that technical way, but it's a way of just saying there is going to be real economic pain. We can't avoid it now. Inflation is so high that to get it down, there has to be actual pain in the real economy.
Right.
Does it happen slowly in 2023 and then into 2024, or does it hit hard in 2023?
Right. And Cheryl Ann sums it up beautifully. She said, thanks for this information. We're clearly not out of the woods yet. So we still have a little ways to go. And I think, with COVID having come about in 2019, of course, we still got to backtrack all that time. And the impact of that was fairly detrimental. So we still have to make up for lost time in a way. So of course, 2023 to 2024 is going to be a little grim. But, it's promising to hear about, more of the job market side of things, specifically for hourly workforce. I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation of this. I'm so sorry. Gardner O'Brien asked, will the stock market continue to be turbulent? Oh, I think we lost you, Curtis. Let's see. I think we lost Curtis for a second. Hopefully he will be back. But I'm curious, while we're waiting for him, if you guys have any thoughts on, the 4-day work week that is coming about, and we're testing it a lot in European countries. I'm curious if this has been something that your business has possibly implemented themselves. If so, feel free to drop that in the chat. I'm going to work on getting Curtis back up and running. While we're waiting for him, I just had him refresh his browser. I do want to share the slides with everybody super quickly and just make sure that you guys all got that. So they should just pop up right on your screen. These are the slides that Curtis presented on today. Oh, there he goes. These are the slides that Curtis presented on today. So if he wanted to share these with you guys, feel free to download them, pass them on to your peers, your coworkers, all that good stuff. Curtis, before we lost you there, we were asking quickly about Gardner's question, will the stock market continue to be turbulent?
Yeah, so we're going to have big swings, and we're going to have big swings on little misses, like, again, the inflation not being slightly negative, being slightly positive, or the estimate for GDP growth in the fourth quarter was going to be 1.7, and it came in at 1.5, and the market's going to react. Inflation just creates a lot of jitteriness and volatility. If I had to guess, we'll get back to our whatever high we hit, whatever 36,000, but it will be not in a sustained, persistent way until 2024, late 2024, maybe early 2025.
Got it. All right. And then I did ask the audience a quick question. I'm curious on, as popularity of a 4-day work week is growing in European countries, what are your thoughts on that? And Tracy said that they actually have tried some of it for some positions, 4 to 10 hour shifts, opposed to the traditional 40-hour work week. So I'm curious if, you have any thoughts on how that might impact the economy, maybe taking consideration what the UK has been doing and kind of what the implications might be there.
I haven't given it that much thought, but off the top of my head, what I would say is that we've learned as an economy, as a society, that we can be a lot more flexible with workforce than we were in, say, February 2020.
Right.
It's not even that long ago, and it's just like, it's hard to believe. I come into the office most days. I just like being here. I'm a lot more efficient and productive.
Mm-hmm.
But that I just came here every 5 days, every week, month after month, and now it's nice to work from home on Friday, and I'm still productive that day, and there's no one here on Fridays, so it works out fine. But that was totally unheard of, and so like all the tools that I needed to work from home didn't exist. So like when you have a contractor come over to work in your house and you're stuck at home, you were just like, you're on a BlackBerry, or not BlackBerry, even that, on your iPhone. That's all I had. I couldn't get my files. I couldn't do all that. Now that's it's everywhere. I can work from anywhere. My kids all play hockey, and 2 to 3 nights a week I'm at a hockey rink. Like tonight I have to be there at 5:10 till 7:30, and I bring my laptop. So I leave here, go pick them up, drive to the rink, get them dressed, take my computer out, sit down, and go back to work and answer all the emails I didn't answer between,
right.
Picking them up and leaving work and getting in the rink. I think if workers want that, they want a 4-day work week, and they prove that they can be as productive, I think that employers will be open to that. I think they all will be more flexible. They want us back in. It doesn't mean that they're not going to increase their flexibility. And here in Washington D.C., the federal government does this. If you it'll be over a 2-week span. You're 80 hours in 9 days. You can take every other Friday off. It seems to work okay. And so I think it could happen. And I think that the pandemic and all of the strides we made for making flexible workforce more available will allow for that.
Nice. Got it. And then we did have a couple questions emailed in. Rich D asked, what impact do you expect the neurodiversity in the workplace movement to have on CEO decision-making, corporate cultures, and hourly staffing in 2023?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I had a chance to think about this one, and I think from a high level, it's really good. We have a worker shortage that existed prior to COVID. We had, I forget the exact numbers, but I think it was 7 million job openings and 7 million unemployed. We had an enormous dislocation in the labor market that's going to exist post-COVID, and that is that the skills that employers needed were not those skills that employees had, the available workers had, and they weren't in the locations where those jobs were. It takes a long time to reskill, and we have lower levels of immigration, and so to fill those jobs, we have to do unique solutions. Certainly, a move toward automation, investment in capital is going to be part of that solution, but finding new workers is also part of it, and this is a great way to do that. So I think we've shown that, again, we're more flexible as a workforce, as an economy, and bringing more people into the workforce is all to the good. We all need to be more adaptable, but I think we've shown that we can do that. Just think about how we were all working in real life together on March, say, 12th of 2020, and then by March 15th, we were all in a remote world, and we didn't really lose a whole lot of production. So in the similar way, bringing new people who have been not included in the labor force will be to a great advantage.
Right. Great. And then this is a awesome question that Margaret L. sent in. And for those who are in the food and beverage, the hospitality industry, this is a great question for you as well. She asked, what are your thoughts on the Fast Food Council in California?
I have to do my best to keep cool on this one because so my background is free market economist. This is really a bad idea. This is essentially wage and price controls. Yeah, we had that on a national level in the 70s. It doesn't work. So it's not going to lead to anything good. What it essentially will be is that it's going to serve as basically a minimum wage, but as a higher minimum wage than could be supported. And that's going to end up with job losses for those who would otherwise be employed at the places where the council will cover, which is unfortunate. It makes it harder to move up the career ladder when you can't get a first job, which is a lot of what these jobs represent. The silver lining is that it will show that this is the wrong thing to do over time. And so hopefully no one else emulates it, and certainly hopefully that we don't emulate it on a national level, but there's absolutely nothing good that's going to come from that.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah, when I saw that, I thought it was a great question. It would be an interesting take if that was, because that's just obviously California, if that ever spread, nationwide. So hopefully it'll kind of stay put and, not necessarily increase or exacerbate from there. But yeah, very interesting take. I think, we have a couple more questions, but I do want to respect everyone's time as we are coming up on that hour. Curtis, thank you so much for joining us today. I know I learned a lot. I'm sure our audience did too. We'll have to have you come back for a part 2, maybe in the near future. Do another quarterly report, maybe talking a little more about 2024. Maybe it'll kind of lighten up. But yeah, thank you again so much for coming on. And everybody, thank you for submitting your questions. Thank you for joining us. And we will have to see you on the next webinar. Thank you, guys.